Chapter 1 of On Sensation and the Sensible in Parva Naturalia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. Parva Naturalia by Aristotle. Translated by William Alexander Hammond. On Sensation and the Sensible. Chapter 1. Now that we have treated of the soul in its essential nature and of the faculties that belong to it, part by part, our next duty is to investigate the subject of living creatures and everything that has life, to determine what functions are specific and what functions are general. Let us then take what has already been said touching the soul for our basis, and as we proceed to the remaining inquiries, let what is first by nature be first in our discussion. The most important vital phenomena, whether one regards the specific or general attributes of animals, are those which are the joint concern of soul and body, such as sensation, memory, anger, desire, and impulse in general, and, one may add, pleasure and pain. These are experienced by almost all animals. In addition to these, however, there are other attributes which are common to all animals that share in life, and others still that belong only to certain animals. The most important of the former class may be enumerated in 4 pairs, viz., sleeping and waking, youth and old age, inspiration and expiration, life and death. We must study the nature of each of these phenomena and the causes of its occurrence. The investigation, too, of the ultimate principles of health and disease is the province of the naturalist, for neither health nor disease can apply to creatures when deprived of life. And so it happens, as I think, that most natural philosophers and those physicians who have a more philosophical understanding of their science conclude in the one case with the investigation of medicine, and in the other begin their practice with deductions from the laws of nature and their application to medicine. The above-mentioned phenomena are evidently the common property of soul and body, for they are all conjoined with sensation, or are mediated by it. Some of them are modifications of sensation, or persistent conditions of it. Others are protective or preservative of sensation, while others still are destructive and negative. That sensation is mediated by the body to the soul is plain, both with and without the use of rational proof. However, regarding the essential nature of sense perception and the reason why animals are endowed with it, we have already stated our views in the treatise on the soul. Every animal, insofar as it is a living creature, must have sensation, for it is in terms of this that we distinguish between animal and non-animal. Touch and taste must belong to all animals individually. Touch for reasons given in the treatise on the soul, and taste on account of food. For it is by taste that animals discriminate between agreeable and disagreeable in foods, and so reject the one and take the other. In a word, flavour is an affection that belongs to the nutritive soul. Sensations that are excited by external objects, such as smell, hearing, and vision, are found in animals capable of locomotion, and are given to all of them for the sake of their preservation, in order that they may scent their food and pursue it, and flee from what is harmful and destructive. In the case of animals endowed with intelligence, they are given for the sake of higher well-being, for these sense perceptions convey to us various distinctions, out of which the knowledge of intellectual and moral concepts is built up. Amongst the senses, vision is the most important, both in itself and for the necessities of life. On the other hand, for the uses of reason, and accidentally, hearing is the most important. The power of vision informs us of many and various distinctions, because all bodies are suffused with colour, so that by means of this sense, more than by any other, we perceive the common properties of objects. By common properties, I mean form, magnitude, motion, number. Hearing, on the other hand, informs us merely of distinctions in sound, and in some instances of distinctions in articulate voice. Indirectly, however, hearing contributes the greatest share to our intellectual life, for it is the spoken and heard word that is the source of knowledge, and hearing is the source not in itself, but accidentally. Language is composed of words, and every word is a symbol. This explains the fact that in cases where men are deprived of one or the other of these senses from birth, the blind are more intelligent than the deaf and dumb. Chapter 2. We have already treated of the function of the several special senses. Writers nowadays attempt to correlate the senses with the physical elements as found in the bodily members in which the sense organs have their natural development. With the fifth sense, they are hard-pressed, not finding it easy to pair 5 senses with 4 elements. All of them agree in regarding vision as connected with fire, on account of a certain phenomenon whose nature they misunderstand, viz., when the eye is pressed and moved, it seems to scintillate. But this takes place in the dark, or when the eyelids are shut, in which case darkness is produced. And there is also another difficulty here. For if it is impossible for a perceiving and seeing subject to be unconscious of a seen object, then the eye must necessarily see itself. Why, then, does this not take place when the eye is at rest? The explanation of this phenomenon, as well as the solution of the entire difficulty, and of the apparent fact that vision is fire, is to be found in the following considerations. It is the nature of smooth surfaces to shine in the darkness, although they produce no light. Now, we observe that the dark central portion of the eye has a smooth surface. This becomes apparent when the eye is moved, because the single organ is thereby made double, an effect which is produced by the rapidity of the motion. In this way, the seeing organ and the seen object appear to be different. For the same reason also, this effect fails to be produced when the motion is not rapid and does not take place in the dark. For it is in a medium of darkness that a smooth surface naturally shines, as we see in the case of the heads of certain fishes, and in the juice of the cuttlefish. The consequence is that when the eye is moved slowly, the seeing organ and seen object do not appear to be at once unitary and dual. When, on the other hand, the movement is rapid, the eye sees itself as in the reflection of a mirror. Now, if vision were fire, as Empedocles declares, and as we read in the Timaeus, and if seeing resulted from the passage of light out of the eye, as from a lamp, the question arises, why is it that we do not see in the dark also? To say, as the Timaeus does, that the light when it passes out from the eye is extinguished in the darkness, is a totally empty assertion. For what is meant by an extinction of light? The warm and the dry, it is true, are nullified by the moist and the cold, as one sees in the case of a coal fire or a flame, but neither of these has anything to do with light. If, however, they are attributes of light, but are concealed from us owing to their subtle presence, then light ought to be extinguished in the day during rain, and darkness should increase in frosty weather. Flame and ignited bodies are so affected, but nothing of the sort takes place in the case of light. Empedocles appears to hold the view that vision results from the eyes radiating light, as we said before. His own words, at any rate, are as follows. Quote, as a man taking thought for his journey a lantern prepares, whose flame flashes light through the blustering night, as he passes, and shutters he fastens, defence from winds, to scatter the breath of the blowing blasts, while the light pierces through, by its fineness, and gleams over the threshold unfailing. So of old, fire elemental was fixed in membranes, and suffused the round pupil, held in thin tissues, a check to the water, while the fire pierces through by its fineness. Close quote. Sometimes he gives the above explanation of vision, and at other times he explains it by means of emanations from visible objects. Democritus says that vision is due to water, and in this he is right, but he is wrong in thinking that it consists in reflection, for reflection is produced because the eye is a smooth surface. Vision, however, does not take place in this smooth surface, but in the seeing subject. Now, the condition to which he refers is only a reflection of light. He has, however, as I think, no clear idea whatever concerning the general nature of images and reflection. It is also strange that it never occurs to him to raise the question why it is that the eye alone sees, while no other object in which images are reflected has vision. His statement that vision partakes of the nature of water is true, but vision is not due to the fact that the eye is water, but to the fact that it is transparent, which characteristic it has also in common with the air. Water, however, is easier to fix and is thicker than air, and it is for this reason that the eye and its pupil are composed of water. This can be proved also from actual facts. When the eyes are destroyed, water is seen to flow out of them, and even in their quite embryonic stage, the eyes are exceedingly limpid and brilliant. Further, the white of the eye in sanguineous animals is fat and oily, which serves the purpose of keeping the humid element from congealing. Consequently, the eye can resist cold better than any other organ of the body. No one ever experienced the sensation of cold in the interior of the eye. The eyes of bloodless animals are covered with a hard skin, which furnishes protection. The theory is altogether irrational which makes vision consist, as some hold, in a sort of radiation, and regards this radiation of something from the eye as extending to the stars, or as extending to some point, and there effecting a combination with the object. It would be better to assume that this combination of the eye with its object were in the eye's original nature. But even this is nonsense. For what is one to understand by this combination of light with light? Or how is such a thing to take place? For nothing combines in a haphazard way with anything else. Further, how can the internal light combine with an external one? For between them is the intervening membrane. Regarding the fact that there is no vision without light, we have spoken elsewhere. But whether the intervening medium between the visible object and the eye is light or air, it is in any case the motion through this medium that produces sight. And it is reasonable to regard the interior of the eye as composed of water, for water is diaphanous, and as nothing external is seen without light, the same thing applies to the internal. The internal also must, therefore, be diaphanous. Since this diaphanous is not air, it must be water, for the soul or the perceptive power of the soul is not found on the eye's surface, but evidently within. Consequently, the eye's interior must be diaphanous and sensitive to light, and this we can see empirically, for cases have happened in war where persons have received such a blow across the temples that the ocular conduits were severed, and darkness seemed to ensue, just as when a lamp is put out, and this is due to the fact that the diaphanous, i.e. the pupil as we call it, was cut off, as in the snuffing of a lamp. If, therefore, this takes place in some such way as we describe, it is evidently necessary to render an explanation of this kind, and to correlate each sense organ with one of the elements, viz. The seeing power of the eye we must derive from water, the sense for sound from the air, and smell we must associate with fire. For the organ of smell is potentially what smell itself is actually. The sensible object stimulates the sensation into actuality, and consequently the latter must have an antecedent potential existence. Smell is a smoke-like exhalation, and this is derived from fire. It is for this reason, too, that the organ of smell is especially assigned to the environment of the brain, for the material substrate of cold is potentially warm. And the same explanation holds good for the development of the eye. It is formed from a part of the brain, for the brain is the moistest and coolest member of the body. The organ of touch is derived from the element earth, and taste is a form of touch. Consequently, the organs of these two senses, taste and touch, are found to conduct towards the heart. The heart occupies a counterposition to the brain and is the warmest member of the body. Regarding the sense organs of the body, let the above determination suffice. End of chapter 2. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards. Chapter 3 of On Sensation and the Sensible in Parva Naturalia by Aristotle, translated by William Alexander Hammond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. Chapter 3. In the treatise on the soul, I have given a general account of the objects of sense in their application to the several sense organs, such as colour, sound, smell, flavour, and the tangible. I have explained their function and their activity, organ by organ. But we must also determine what each of these things is apart from the organ, e.g., we must ask, what is colour? What is sound? What is smell? What is flavour? We must likewise inquire regarding the tactual, and we must begin with colour. Everything has a twofold significance, viz., that of actuality and potentiality. It has been explained in the treatise on the soul in what way actual colour and actual sound coincide with and differ from the actual sensations of seeing and hearing. We must now explain what each of these sensible objects must be in order to produce sensation and its activity. We have already said in the above-named treatise regarding light that it is the colour of a diaphanous medium accidentally produced. For when anything fire-like is found in the diaphanous, its presence constitutes light, and its absence signifies darkness. What we understand by diaphanous is not a property peculiar to air, or water, or to any other so-called body, but it is a certain natural constitution and power common to both these bodies, and found also in certain others, in greater or less degree, but which has no independent and separate existence. And furthermore, as there must be a limiting surface in bodies, so here also. Light is found in an indeterminate diaphanous. It is also evident that the diaphanous in bodies must have a surface, and that this surface is colour is plain from observed facts. For colour is found either in the boundary, or it is itself the boundary. It is for this reason that the Pythagoreans characterized the visible superficies as colour. Colour indeed is given in the boundary properties of body, although it does not itself constitute that boundary. On the contrary, one must suppose that the same colour quality which is observed on the exterior applies also to the interior. Both air and water are seen to be coloured, for even their shimmer is colour. In these cases, however, air and the sea, because of their unfixed character, do not have the same colour when viewed near at hand and from a distance. In solid bodies, on the other hand, the appearance of the colour is fixed, unless the surrounding medium makes it shift. It is evident, therefore, that the principle which is sensitive to colour is, in both the former and the latter instances, the same. The diaphanous, then, in so far as it is found in bodies, and it is found more or less in them all, causes them to be saturated with colour. Inasmuch as colour is found in the boundary of bodies, it would also be found in the boundary of the diaphanous substance. Consequently, colour might be defined as the boundary of the diaphanous in a definite body. Colour attaches also to diaphanous bodies themselves, such as water and other similar elements, and it is also found in all such bodies as have a surface colour which is peculiar to the body itself. There is then, on the one hand, the possibility that the positive principle which in the air produces light should also be contained in the diaphanous. On the other hand, it is possible that this should not be the case, but that the condition then should be one of privation. As in the case of air, we have the two phenomena, light and darkness, so in bodies we have the two qualities, white and black. Regarding the other colours, we must now decide, after analysis, in how many ways they can be produced. For black and white may be so juxtaposed that each of the two, on account of its minuteness, when taken alone, will be invisible, while the combination of the two will be visible. The latter cannot be seen either as white or black, but inasmuch as it must have some colour, and it can be neither of these two, it must be a mixed colour, and different in kind from the others. It is then a possible supposition that there are several colours besides white and black, but their manifoldness is due to proportion. This proportion can be expressed by the relation of 3:2, or of 3:4. Or colours can be related to each other in terms of other numbers, and some may not be expressible at all in terms of any proportion, but in terms of some incommensurable plus and minus. The same thing applies also to harmony of tones. Those colours which are expressed by harmonious numbers, as is also true of tone harmonies, appear to be the most pleasing, such as sea purple, crimson, and a few others like them. They are few for the same reason that harmonious tones are few. The other colours are not numerically expressible. Or is it true that all colours are numerically expressible, although some colours depend upon a regular order, while others depend upon an irregular order, and the latter have this character when they are not pure? This is one explanation of the genesis of colours. Another explanation is that they shine through one another, as we see sometimes in the works of artists, when they superadd a colour on a background of a different colour, e.g. when they wish to produce the effect of an object seen in the water or in the air. So it is also with the sun, which in its own nature appears white, but red when seen through mist and smoke. And many other colours will be produced in the same way as above described. That is to say, a certain proportion might be supposed to exist between the colours on the superficies and the colours in the depths, and others again may not be expressible in terms of proportion at all. It is therefore absurd to say with the ancients that colours are effluxes, and for this reason are visible. For, in their opinion, it is absolutely necessary that sensation be effected through contact, and it is consequently better to say at once that the medium of sensation is set in motion by the sensible object, and that in this way sensation is produced by contact and not by effluxes. In the case of juxtaposed colours, just as one must suppose an invisible magnitude, so must one suppose an imperceptible moment of time in order to explain the fact that the movements issue imperceptibly, and because they are simultaneously visible, the impression is a single one. There is, however, no such necessity here, but the colour on the superficies, when unmoved, and when set in motion by its substrate, produces unlike motions in the medium. Consequently, it appears different, and neither white nor black, so that if an invisible magnitude is not possible, but every magnitude must be visible from a certain distance, so there must be here also a certain mixture of colours. In this way, one may suppose that in objects viewed from a distance, a certain common colour is seen, for that there is no invisible magnitude is a matter that must be investigated later. If a mixture of bodies takes place, then it is not merely in the way that some think, viz. By the juxtaposition of minimal parts which are imperceptible to our senses, but also in the form of a general mixture of the entire substance together, as explained in outline in our treatise on mixture. By the former method of composition, only those substances can be mixed which are capable of analysis into minimal parts, e.g., men, horses, or seeds. In the case of men, a man is the minimal part. In the case of horses, a horse. Consequently, in both instances, the mass is formed by juxtaposition of these minimal parts. We do not, however, speak of a man being mixed with a horse. Whatever cannot be analyzed into minimal homogeneous parts is incapable of mixture in this sense, but only in the sense of total mixture, which is what naturally takes place in most cases. In our treatise on mixture, we have already explained how this can take place. Where bodies are mixed, their colours must evidently be mixed also, and this is the principal cause of the multiplicity of colours, which is not explained by their being superposed or by their juxtaposition. It is not true that what is mixed has one colour when viewed nearby and another when viewed at a distance, for it has one colour when viewed from all points. And colours will be manifold because of the possibility of manifold proportions being employed in mixtures, some of which will be based on numerical proportion, others on that of disproportionate mass. Further, the same thing may be said of mixed colours as was said of juxtaposed and superposed colours. The explanation of the fact that we have fixed and definite varieties of colours, flavours, and sounds will be given later. Chapter 4. We have now explained the meaning of colour and the cause of its multiplicity. We had already discussed the subject of sound and articulate speech in the treatise on the soul. Smell and flavour now remain to be discussed. Both these terms signify almost identical natural affections, only each of them is found in a different organ. The quality of flavours is more distinct to us than that of smells. The reason is that our sense of smell is inferior to the same sense in other animals, and is inferior to all our other senses, while we of all animals have the most accurate sense of touch, and taste is a sort of touch. Water in its own nature has no flavour, and yet it is necessary that water should contain within itself the varieties of flavours, which, owing to their infinitesimal character, are indiscernible, as Empedocles says, or else there must be in water some such matter as is the universal germ origin of flavours, and in this way all flavours are generated out of water. Different flavours from different parts, or again, supposing that water contains no qualitative differences, we must then find some other efficient cause of flavour, such as heat, or the influence of the sun. The error of the Empedoclean theory is very easy to detect, for we actually observe flavours undergoing change under the influence of heat, e.g. when we expose fruits to the sun by removing their pericarps, or by heating them before a fire. They do not acquire this new flavour by drawing it out of the water, but by undergoing a change in the removal of the pericarp itself. When fruits are dried and stored, they become in time, instead of sweet, pungent or bitter, or change their flavour variously, and when cooked, they acquire, so to speak, all sorts of flavours. So too, the theory that water is a panspermic matter is impossible, for we observe that out of one and the same thing, as out of the same foodstuff, different flavours are generated. There remains the theory that water, by undergoing some external influence, changes. It is plain that the phenomenon which we call flavour is not due to the potency of heat. For water is the thinnest of all liquids, subtler than oil itself. Oil, however, is more expansile than water because of its viscous character, water being non-cohesive. For this reason, it is harder to hold water in one's hand than it is moisture, as of other things, to be affected by its opposite, and its opposite is the dry. Consequently, it is affected by fire, which is by nature dry. Now heat is the peculiar property of fire, and the dry is the peculiar property of the earth, as was said in the Treatise on the Elements. Neither fire, nor earth, nor any other element, as such, acts or is acted upon. It is only in so far as each thing contains in itself the principle of opposition that it either acts or is acted upon. As, therefore, those who dissolve a colour or a flavour in water cause the water to absorb it, so nature acts upon the dry and earthy elements, and by filtering water through these elements, and stimulating them into activity by heat, it causes the moist element to acquire a certain quality. This condition, which is wrought in moisture by means of the above-mentioned dry element, is flavour, and it consists in the conversion of a potential taste into an actual one. For the sense organ, which is already in a condition of potentiality, passes over into a condition of actuality. The process of sensation does not resemble learning so much as it resembles contemplation. That flavours do not attach to everything dry, but only to the dry that is nutritive, either as a positive or negative condition, one may conclude from the fact that the dry is not found apart from the moist, nor the moist apart from the dry. Neither one when taken alone is foodstuff for living creatures, but only when combined. In animal food it is the tactual elements which effect growth and decay, and it is by virtue of the warmth or cold in the assimilated food that these phenomena are produced. For these are the properties that cause growth and decay. The administered food nourishes in so far as it is gustable, for everything is nourished by means of the sweet, whether pure or mixed. This subject must be more definitely treated in the work on generation. For the present we only touch upon it so far as necessary. Heat disposes to growth and brings food into a prepared condition. It absorbs what is light and rejects the salt and bitter because of their heaviness. What external heat effects in external bodies is also produced by internal heat in animals and plants. Nourishment, then, is caused by the sweet. The other flavours are mingled in food in the same way as the bitter and pungent, i.e., to serve as a relish. This is for the purpose of counterbalance, and because the sweet is over-nutritive and swims on the stomach. As colours are a combination of white and black, so flavours are derived from sweet and bitter. They depend severally on a proportion of more or less, on a proportion of mixture and motion, either numerically expressible or indeterminate. Those mixtures, however, which produce pleasure are numerically expressible. The oily flavour is to be classed with the sweet. The salt and bitter are closely allied, while the sour, pungent, astringent, and acid are intermediary. And so the varieties of flavours and colours are pretty nearly the same in number, for there are 6 of each, if one regards, as is reasonable, the grey as a sort of black. We have then to include yellow in white, just as we referred the oily flavour to the sweet, while crimson, sea purple, green, and blue are intermediary between white and black, and all other shades are combinations of these. As black is privation of the white in a diaphanous medium, so the salt and bitter are privation of the sweet in a nutritive moist substance. Consequently, the ashes of anything that has been burnt are bitter, for the potable element has been consumed. Democritus and most of the physiologers who treat the subject of sensation make the most remarkable blunder, for they resolve all sensible objects into the tangible. If indeed this is correct, each of the senses becomes evidently a sense of touch. It is not difficult to see that this is impossible. Further, they treat the common functions of all the senses as special functions. For the perception of magnitude, figure, roughness, smoothness, and sharpness and bluntness in solid bodies is the common function of all the senses, and if not of all, then at least the common function of sight and touch. It is in these perceptions, therefore, that the senses are subject to error, but they are not subject to error in their special sensations, e.g. sight is not fallible regarding colour, nor hearing regarding sound. Again, these physiologers refer the special functions to the general, as Democritus does with white and black, the latter of which he identifies with the rough, and the former with the smooth. And he reduces flavour to atomic forms. And yet it is either not the function of any sense to discern common properties, or else this power belongs to the eye more than to any other organ. If, however, this power falls rather to the lot of taste, it is at any rate the function of the most delicate sense to discriminate the slightest distinctions, each after its kind, so that taste would have to discriminate common properties better than any other sense, and be the most discerning judge of atomic figures. Further, all sensible objects contain the principle of opposition, e.g. in colour, black is the opposite of white, and in flavour, bitter is the opposite of sweet. But one figure does not appear to be the opposite of another figure, for to what sort of polygon would a circle be opposed? Further, the atomic figures being infinite in number, it necessarily follows that flavours are also infinite in number. For what is the explanation of the fact that one flavour produces a sensation and another flavour does not produce it? We have now treated the subject of the gustable and flavour. The other aspects of flavour receive their proper consideration in the treatise on the physiology of plants. End of chapter 4. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards. Chapter 5 of On Sensation and the Sensible in Parva Naturalia by Aristotle, translated by William Alexander Hammond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Chapter 5. In like manner, one must also treat of smell, for the same effect which is produced by the dry or the moist is produced in another connection by savoury moisture in air and water equally. Now, we observe that the diaphanous is a common principle in these two elements. The element, however, is not odoriferous by virtue of its being diaphanous, but by virtue of its capacity to exude and throw off dry savour. For smell is exercised not only in the air, but also in water. This is evidently so in the case of fishes and mollusks. For these are known to be endowed with smell, although there is no air in the water. For the air comes to the surface when found in water, and they have no respiration. If one assumes that both air and water are moist elements, smell would be the dry sapidity in the moist, and such would be the nature of an odoriferous body. That this condition in an object is derived from a sapid element is a plain conclusion from things that do and do not emit smell. For the simple elements such as fire, air, earth, and water are non-odorous, because the moist and dry in them are non-sapid, excepting when a combination is produced. This is why even the sea has a smell. It contains a sapid dry element. Salts are more odorous than nitre, as is proven by the oil derived from them. Nitre, in turn, is more odorous than earth. Further, a stone is inodorous, for it is without sapidity. Woods, on the other hand, are odorous, for they are sapid, and, amongst woods, those that are watery are less odorous. Further, amongst metals, gold is inodorous, for it is not sapid. Bronze, however, and iron are odorous. When the moist element is burned out of metals, the slag becomes still less odorous. Silver and tin are more odorous than some and less odorous than other metals, for they contain moisture. Some writers regard smell as a smoke-like exhalation, which is common to earth and air, and all the naturalists fall back on this explanation of smell. And so Heraclitus made the remark that if all things were smoke, we should discern everything by our nostrils. Now, the naturalists all explain smell on this theory, some of them describing it as vapor, others as an exhalation, and others as a combination of both of these. Vapor is a kind of moisture, whereas a smoke-like exhalation is, as we have said, common to air and earth. Water is derived from vapor, and a sort of earth is developed from smoke-like exhalation. But neither of these two seems to be the odorous, for vapor is due to water, while smoke-like exhalation cannot possibly be generated in water, and yet creatures that live in the water have the sense of smell, as was said above. Again, exhalations here have the same meaning as emanations, and if the emanation theory was wrong, so is this wrong. It is clear that the moisture which is found in the air, for the air also has a moist character, and in water is capable of deriving something from the sapid dry element, and of being affected by it. Furthermore, if the dry element, when saturated, as it were, acts in moisture in the same way as it does in air, smells must evidently correspond to tastes. But precisely this fact is found in certain flavors and savours, for there are pungent, sweet, harsh, astringent, oily smells, and one might say that rancid odours correspond to bitter tastes. As the former, therefore, are revolting to the taste, so rancid tastes are revolting to the smell. Evidently, then, that quality which in water is flavour, in air and water is smell. This explains why cold and frost blunt flavours and obscure smells, for cold and frost nullify heat, which is the moving and active principle here. There are two sorts of odorous objects, for it is untrue that there are no varieties of odorous objects, as some maintain. Such varieties do exist. One must, however, explain in what sense this is true, and in what sense not true. One variety corresponds, as clearly explained, to flavour, and contains the pleasurable and painful accidentally. For, owing to the fact that these smells concern our nutritive power, they are agreeable to those who have desire, and disagreeable to those who are sated and feel no desire. Neither is the smell agreeable to those to whom the food which has the smell is disagreeable. Consequently, these smells contain, as we said, the pleasant and painful accidentally, and this is the reason why they are common to all animals. There is another variety of smells which are pleasant in themselves, e.g., the fragrance of flowers, for they incite us in no respect, whether more or less, to food, nor do they in any way contribute to the stirring of any desire. They have rather the opposite effect. What Stratus says, mocking Euripides, is true. When lentil soup you cook, pray add no spices to it. By mixing such spices in their potations, men nowadays force pleasure, as is their habit, believing that the pleasure, which is really derived from two sensations, is derived from only one. Smell of this sort is peculiar to man, but smell that is based on flavour is sensed by other animals, as remarked above. The varieties of the latter, because the pleasant is incidental, are classified in terms of flavours, which does not apply to the former class, because there the smell is pleasant or disagreeable in itself. The reason why this class of smells is peculiar to man is because of the condition of his brain. For man's brain is by nature cool, and the blood in its surrounding veins is thin and pure, though easily chilled, which explains why the evaporation of food, when cooled in this region, causes catarrhal colds. And so this variety of smell has been developed in man as beneficial to his health. For no other function can be ascribed to this class of smells, although this function is evidently exercised by them. Food, whether solid or liquid, although agreeable, is often harmful, but the smell exhaled from savoury food indicates, one may say, what is absolutely and always beneficial to man in whatsoever condition he is. Consequently, smell is mediated by respiration, not in all animals, but in man, the quadrupeds, and such other sanguineous animals as have a larger share in the employment of air. For smells being transmitted to the brain by virtue of the levity of the heat in them, the regions about the brain are thereby the more healthy. For the potency of smell is naturally warm. Nature employs respiration for two purposes. Its main purpose is to assist the functioning of the chest. Its secondary function is to transmit smell. For in respiration the air produces, as it were in passage, motion in the nostrils. Smell of this sort is peculiar to human nature, for man has, in proportion to his size, the largest and moistest brain of all animals. For this reason, man is the only animal, one may say, that senses the smell of flowers and similar smells, and finds pleasure in them. For the warmth and movement in these smells is proportional to the excess of moisture and coolness in the brain. To the other animals that are endowed with lungs for respiration, nature has given the perception of another kind of smell, so as to avoid the creation of two sense organs. It is enough for these respiring animals that they have the sensation of only one class of smells, while man discriminates both classes. That the non-respiring animals possess the sense of smell is evident, for fishes and all the varieties of insects, on account of the connection between food and smell, distinguish smells with precision and at a distance, as we observe in the case of bees, and that variety of small ants, sometimes called snips, and purple sea fish, as well as in the case of many other similar animals which have a keen sense of smell for food. The organ of sensation is not so clearly defined. One might therefore raise the question as to the organ of the sense of smell, although smell is mediated exclusively by respiration. This is plainly so in all respiring animals. None of the above-mentioned animals, however, respire, and yet they perceive smells, unless we are to assume an additional sense beyond the five, and this is impossible. For it is smell that senses the odorous, and these animals detect odour, though perhaps not in the same way as respiring animals. In respiring animals, the breath lifts up a superficial membrane, a sort of cover as it were, for which reason they do not smell without respiration, whereas in the non-respiring animals this is lacking, just as over the eyes some animals have eyelids, and without lifting these do not see, while others are hard-eyed and have no lids, and so do not need to lift any covering, but see at once from the moment they are able to see. And so too, no other animal feels discomfort from a smell which is intrinsically malodorous unless it chances to be harmful. But by these harmful smells, animals are sometimes destroyed, just as men often get a headache from coal gas and frequently lose their lives. In the same way, other animals are destroyed by sulphur and asphalt fumes, and because they are so affected by such fumes, they avoid them. But for malodor as such, they take no thought, although many vegetables have bad smells, excepting in so far as taste or food is influenced by it. Inasmuch as the number of the senses is uneven, and every uneven number has a middle term, it seems that smell occupies a middle position between the senses that operate by direct contact, viz., touch and taste, on the one hand, and those which function indirectly, through a medium, viz., sight and hearing, on the other hand. Consequently, the odorous object is something which affects foods, for these fall under the category of the tangible, and further it affects audition, because smells are sensed in the media of air and water. Smell, then, is in a way common to these two things, and is found in the tangible, the audible, and the diaphanous. It is with good reason, therefore, that smell has been compared to the imbruing and washing of a dry element found in the moist and liquid. Regarding the sense in which one may or may not apply the term species to odours, let the foregoing discussion suffice. There is a view held by certain Pythagoreans which is ill-founded. They hold that certain animals feed on smells. Now we observe in the first place that food is a composite thing, For the creatures which are nourished are not simple, and consequently there is an excrement of food, sometimes within the animal itself, and sometimes external, as in the case of plants. Further, water, when taken alone and unmixed, is not fitted to yield nourishment, for what is assimilated into the body must be of a solid nature. Again, it is much less reasonable that air can become solid matter. In addition to this, we observe that all animals have a receptacle for food, from which, after its entrance, the body assimilates it. The sense organ, however, is situated in the head, and smell enters with a breath-like inhalation, so that it penetrates to the respiratory region. That smell, as such, does not contribute to nourishment is plain. That it does, however, contribute to health is evident from the sensation itself and from what has been said, so that what flavour is to the nutritive organ and to the parts nourished, this smell is to health. Let these, then, be our conclusions regarding the several sense organs. Chapter 6. One might raise the question whether, supposing all bodies to be infinitely divisible, the sensible qualities of bodies are also infinitely divisible. Such qualities as colour, flavour, smell, sound, weight, cold, heat, lightness, roughness, and softness. Or must we say that this is impossible? For every one of these qualities produces sensation. They all receive their name from their capacity to stimulate sensation. Therefore, sensation must be infinitely divisible, and every magnitude must be sensible. For it is impossible to perceive a white object without its having dimensions. Were this not true, it would be possible to have a body without colour or weight or any similar quality, in which case it would be absolutely imperceptible, for these qualities constitute the sensible. The sensible, then, would have to be composed of the non-sensible, but it must be composed of sensible qualities, for it cannot be composed of mathematical elements. And furthermore, what organ could we use for the discrimination and cognition of such elements? Could we employ reason? But they are not rational elements. Neither does reason think the external world, excepting in conjunction with sensation. At the same time, if this view of the infinite divisibility of sensible qualities were true, it would appear to furnish support for the advocates of atomic magnitudes, for in this way the problem would be solved. It is, however, impossible. This subject has been discussed in our treatise On Motion. In the solution of these questions, one will see why it is that the various forms of colour, flavour, sound, and other sensible qualities are determinate. For in things that have extremes, the internal properties must also be determinate. The opposite is an extreme. Now, every sensible quality implies opposition, e.g. in colours, white and black, in flavour, sweet and bitter, and in everything else the opposites form extremes. The continuous is therefore divisible into infinite unequal parts, but into determinate equal parts. Now, whatever is not in its own nature continuous is divisible into determinate forms. Inasmuch as qualities must be interpreted as forms, and inasmuch as continuity is always given in these, we must suppose a difference between the potential and actual. This is why the 10,000th part of a visible grain of millet is unseen, although the eye rests upon it, and so too a quarter tone is undetected by hearing, although the whole continuous melody is heard. But the interval from mean to extreme is not appreciable to us, and the same thing applies to the excessively small amongst other sensible objects. They are discernible potentially, but not actually, and when regarded in isolation. A foot line is contained in a 2-foot line potentially, but actually only after division has been made. When excessively small parts like these are separated off, it is reasonable to suppose that they would be lost in their environment, just as a tiny particle of flavour is lost in the sea. Nevertheless, since this excessively small particle, when regarded in itself and in isolation, is imperceptible, for the excessively small has only a potential existence in a body that is more discernible, neither is any sensible object of this sort, in isolation, actually perceptible, and yet it is a sensible object because it is so potentially, and will be actually so when added on to something. We have now explained that certain magnitudes and qualities are imperceptible, and have stated the reason for this, and have shown in what sense things are perceptible, and in what sense they are not. When, however, inherent qualities are so constituted in reference to themselves as to be actually perceptible, and not merely so in conjunction with an entire body, but also when regarded alone, then colours, flavours, and sounds must be numerically limited. One might raise the question whether sensible objects, or the movements excited by sensible objects, whatever be the way in which sensation is affected by their activity, are first transmitted to a medium, as appears to be the case with smell and sound. For a person standing nearby has an earlier perception of a smell, and a sound reaches one some time after a blow. Is the same thing true of the visible and of light? According to Empedocles, sunlight is first transmitted to a medium before it reaches the eye or the earth, and this seems to be reasonable. For whatever is moved from one point to another, so that a certain time must elapse in which motion from one point to another takes place. But all time is divisible, and consequently there is a moment when the ray is not yet visible, but is still in transit in the medium. Also, if everything at the same moment hears, and has heard, and in a word perceives, and has perceived, and there is no time process in sensations, nevertheless they lack this process in the same way in which sound, after the blow has been struck, has not yet reached the ear. The shifting of letters also shows this plainly, because their movement takes place in a medium. For people appear not to have heard what was said, because the air has shifted. Is this true also of colour and light? For it is not owing to a particular condition that one thing sees and another is seen, like two equivalent terms. For it would not then have been necessary for either to be in a given position. For when things are equivalent, nearness or remoteness from each other makes no difference. It is reasonable that succession in time should be found in sound and smell, for like air and water they are continuous, and yet their movement is divisible, and so it sometimes happens that the nearest and most remote persons perceive the same smell, and at other times this is not the case. Some persons find a difficulty also in the following. It is impossible, some say, for different persons to hear, see, or smell the same thing in the same way. For it is impossible for several persons who are separate from each other to hear and smell alike. In that event, the unitary object of sensation would have to be separated from itself. The primary stimulus, as a bell, frankincense, or a fire, is perceived by all as numerically one and the same, but in its peculiar qualities it is perceived with numerical differences, though in its essential nature as one and the same thing, for which reason many persons see, smell, or hear the same thing at the same time. One is not concerned here, however, with bodies, but with qualities and motion, otherwise we should not have this phenomenon, which are impossible apart from body. The question of light is different, for light has a substantial nature and is not a motion. In general, the same determinations are not to be applied to transformation and motion. Spatial motions take place, as one might suppose, first into a medium. Sound is thought to be the motion of something subject to spatial change, whereas that which undergoes transformation does so in a way different from spatial change. It is possible that transformation takes place in mass, and not first by halves, as in the case of water which freezes at once entire. Nevertheless, if what is being heated or frozen should be of considerable bulk, one part is affected by the adjacent part, and the first part undergoes changes through its own alteration, and it is not necessary that the entire mass undergo alteration at the same time. Taste would also be subject to the same conditions as smell, if we lived in a medium of water and perceived smells from a distance without contact. When we have a medium for the sense organ, it is reasonable to suppose we do not receive all our impressions at once, excepting in the instance of light, on grounds already mentioned. And sight is also accepted on the same grounds, for light is the cause of sight. End of chapter 6. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards. Chapter 7 of On Sensation and the Sensible in Parva Naturalia by Aristotle. Translated by William Alexander Hammond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. Chapter 7. Another similar problem touching sensation arises here, viz., whether or not it is possible to experience two sensations at one and the same moment of time, supposing it to be true that the stronger stimulus always displaces the weaker. For this reason, persons do not see an object that falls upon the eye if they chance to be deep in thought, or exercised by fear, or listening to a loud sound. Let this serve as a fundamental truth, and let us also observe that it is easier to perceive what is simple than what is mixed, e.g., it is easier to taste unmixed wine than mixed, and so with honey and colour, and it is easier to distinguish the highest note when taken alone than when heard in accord with the octave, because the two things obscure each other. This occurs in cases where a unity is produced from several elements. If, then, the stronger displaces the weaker stimulus, it must happen, in case they are simultaneous, that even the stronger stimulus becomes weaker than it would be if it were perceived alone. For the weaker, when mixed with it, detracts from its clearness, supposing it to be true that everything taken simply is more accurately perceptible. If the two are equal, neither one will be perceived, for they will counteract each other equally. But it is impossible to have a simple sensation. Consequently, we shall have either no sensation at all, or a new one fused out of both elements. And this appears to be what actually happens with mixed elements, so long as they are mixed. Since a fusion of certain things is possible, and of others not, the latter are such as fall within the province of different senses. For where extremes are opposite, fusion is possible, but it is not possible to form white and acute into a unity, excepting in an accidental sense, not, however, in the sense in which a union between acute and grave is possible. It is then impossible to have a simultaneous sensation of these qualities, for the stimuli being equal destroy each other, since a unitary stimulus is not derivable from them. If, however, they are unequal, the stronger stimulus produces the sensation, for the soul more readily perceives two stimuli simultaneously when only one sense is concerned in the single act of sensation, as e.g. acute and grave. For simultaneous sensation on the part of a single sense is more easily attained than is the action of two senses, such as sight and hearing. But it is not possible to perceive two things simultaneously with one sense unless they are fused, for the fusion will form a unity, and a single sense can perceive a single thing, and the single sensation is a chronological unit. So then, one necessarily perceives fused stimuli simultaneously, because they are perceived by a sense process which in actuality is single. The single sense in actuality perceives a numerically single object. The single sense in potentiality perceives a specifically single object. If the sensation, therefore, is in actuality single, it will interpret the sense object as a single thing. The sensations must then be fused. When they are not fused, the sensations will be in actuality too. However, there must be a single actuality which corresponds to a single potentiality, and a single moment of time, for the stimulation and exercise of a single sense is once for all single, and its potentiality is single. It is consequently impossible to perceive two objects at one time with a single sense. But if two objects that fall under a single sense cannot be perceived simultaneously, this is plainly much less possible when they fall under two senses, as e.g. white and sweet. For the soul seems to denote what is numerically one not otherwise than in terms of simultaneity, the specifically one in terms of the discriminating sense and the character of the thing. By this I mean that white and black, which are specifically different, are supposedly discriminated by the same sense. Also, sweet and bitter are discriminated by the same sense, although a different sense from the former one. On the other hand, the method of perceiving opposites is different. While coordinated pairs are perceived in the selfsame manner, e.g., just as taste perceives the sweet, so sight perceives the white. As the sense of sight perceives the black, so the former sense perceives bitter. Further, if the sense processes of opposites are opposite to each other, and if it is impossible for opposites to coexist in the same indivisible thing, then where opposites fall under a single sense, as e.g. sweet and bitter, they cannot be perceived simultaneously. And similarly, it can be proven that things which are not opposites cannot be simultaneously perceived. For some colours partake of white and others of black, and this applies equally to other sensations, e.g., amongst flavours, certain ones have the character of sweet and others of bitter. Neither can fused objects be simultaneously perceived, for their ratios have the character of contrariety, e.g. the octave and the fifth, unless they are perceived as one. In this way, and not otherwise, a single ratio of extremes is produced. For in any other case there will be produced at once the ratio of the many to the few, and of the uneven to the even, and on the other hand the ratio of the few to the many, and of the even to the uneven. If coordinates, which are specifically different, are further removed from each other, and differ more than things that are specifically the same, e.g. sweet and white I mention as coordinates, but specifically different, and sweet differs from black more than white does, it would be still less possible for these opposites to be perceived simultaneously than it would be for opposites specifically the same, so that if the latter are not simultaneously perceptible, neither would the former be. In regard to the opinion of certain writers who treat the subject of harmony and say that sounds do not really reach us at the same moment, but only appear to do so, and we do not notice this, the time being imperceptible, the question is whether their opinion is right or not. Here also one might perhaps say that we only appear to hear and see at the same time, because the intervening time is not perceived. This is incorrect. It is impossible for time to be imperceptible, or for us to be unconscious of it, but every moment is perceptible. For when one perceives oneself or something else in continuous time, it is impossible for one to be then unconscious that one is. But if there is in continuous time a moment of such duration that it is altogether imperceptible, it is evident that one would then be unconscious of one's own existence, or would not know whether or not one sees and perceives. Further, even if one has perception, time would not exist, and there would be no object, nor any moment in which sensation should take place, unless it were in the sense that one sees in a part of time, or a part of the object, if there is a measure of time or object which, owing to its smallness, is totally imperceptible. For if one sees the entire earth, one also perceives time itself in its continuity, and not in any of its isolated moments. Let C, B, represent a time division in which one has no perception. One sees then in a particular part of the whole, or sees a particular part, just as one sees the entire earth, viz. By seeing a definite part of it, and how far one walks in a year, viz. By seeing how far one walks in a definite part of a year. But in the division B, C, there is no perception. Now, by virtue of perceiving the whole, A, B, in some definite part of it, one is said to perceive even the entire earth, and the same reasoning holds good of A, C. For one always perceives in a part, and it is impossible to perceive the entirety, and so everything is perceptible, but one does not see what its extent is. For one sees the magnitude of the sun and of the 4-cubit measure from a distance. They are not seen, however, in their real size, but sometimes they seem indivisible, and one does not see the indivisible. The reason for this has been stated in the foregoing. One concludes from this that there is no imperceptible time. We must take into consideration the above-mentioned problem, whether or not it is possible to have several simultaneous sensations. By simultaneous, I mean such as are experienced in the same part of the soul and in one indivisible moment of time. In the first place, then, is it possible that the sensations be simultaneous in the sense that they are experienced in different parts of the soul and not in one indivisible part, though by parts which are indivisible in the sense of forming a continuous whole? Or, to take first what affects the single sense, as e.g. sight, shall we say that if different colours are sensed by different parts of sight, it will then have several parts specifically the same? For its repeated sensations belong to the same species. But if one says that, as in the instance of our two eyes, a certain unity and single activity is produced, so nothing prevents our regarding the soul in the same way. If, however, the combination of both forms an unit, then that which is perceived will be an unit, and if they remain uncombined, then the result will likewise be uncombined. Again, the same sensations will be manifold in the sense in which one speaks of sciences as manifold, for neither is there any actuality apart from its corresponding potentiality, nor is there any sensation apart from actuality. If one does not experience simultaneously the sensations which occur in a single indivisible part of the soul, it is clear that one does not experience others simultaneously. For it is simpler to perceive these several things simultaneously than it is to perceive generically different things simultaneously. But if the soul senses sweet with one part and white with another part, the derivative of these two is either an unit or it is not an unit. But it must be an unit, for the perceiving organ is an unit. What is the unit, then, with which this organ is concerned? For we have no unit from sweet and white. There must, therefore, be some unitary principle in the soul, whereby it perceives things as wholes, as remarked above, but things generically different are sensed by different organs. Is then the principle whereby we perceive sweet and white a single organ, in so far as these qualities are united? But when they are actually isolated, is it a different organ that senses each of them? What applies to the things themselves applies similarly to the soul. For numerically one and the same thing is white and sweet, and possesses many other qualities, unless the qualities be regarded as isolated from one another, and yet the essential nature of each quality is different. One must likewise conclude, in reference to the soul, that one and the same principle, numerically regarded, perceives everything, although its mode of expression is different, in some cases generically different, and in others specifically different. Simultaneous sensations, therefore, are experienced in one and the same principle of the soul, but not in one and the same relation to this principle. It is evident that every sensible object has a certain magnitude, and that it is impossible to perceive what is indivisible. There is a point from which it is impossible for one to see, viz., a point of infinite removal, but the point from which vision is possible is determinate. The same applies to the odorous and audible, and to such sensations as are not tactual. There is an extreme point of remoteness from which vision is no longer possible, and a point of nearness at which vision begins. This point must be indivisible, and what is beyond it is not perceptible, and what is on this side of it must be perceptible. If, indeed, an indivisible thing is perceptible, then it will follow, when one places it at the extreme point from which it is no longer visible, and again at the point where perception begins, that it is simultaneously visible and invisible, and this is impossible. We have now treated in general and in particular the subject of the organs and objects of sensation. In what remains, we must first investigate the subject of memory and of memory's process. End of chapter 7 and end of On Sensation and the Sensible. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards. Chapter 1 of On Memory and Recollection in Parva Naturalia by Aristotle, translated by William Alexander Hammond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. Chapter 1. In regard to memory and its process, we must determine what its nature is, by what agency it is produced, and to what physical organ the phenomenon of memory, as well as that of recollection, is to be ascribed. For the same persons are not endowed with good memory and good recollection, but, as a rule, phlegmatic natures remember well, while the quick and ready-witted are apt at recollection. First of all, we must grasp what is understood by the object of memory, for one is often mistaken about this. The future cannot be the object of memory. This is rather the object of conjecture and expectation, and we might even have a science of expectation, as some describe the subject of prophecy. Neither can the present be its subject matter, for our senses are concerned with this. By sensation, we do not have cognizance either of the future or of the past, but only of the present. Memory, on the other hand, regards the past. No person would say that he remembers the present while it is present, e.g., that he remembers seeing the white object while he sees it. Neither does one remember the object of contemplation, so long as the act of contemplation and thought continues. But one merely says that in the former case one sees, and in the latter one knows. When, however, one possesses knowledge or sensation which is not in actuality, then one remembers that the angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles, because one has learned it, or thought it out, or, on the other hand, has merely heard it, or visually observed it, or found it out in some such way. For when memory actually takes place, one must say that the process in the soul is such that one formerly heard, perceived, or thought the thing. Consequently, memory is neither sensation nor conceptual thought, but it is the condition or modified form of one of these after the lapse of time. There is no memory of the present in the present moment, as we have said, but there is perception of the present, expectation of the future, and memory of the past. Consequently, all memory is associated with time. Therefore, only those creatures that have perception of time have memory, and memory attaches to that organ whereby time is perceived. Now, we have already discussed imagination in the treatise On the Soul, and we concluded there that thought is impossible without an image, for we find in thought the same conditions as in drawing figures. In the latter, without needing a triangle of a definite magnitude, we nevertheless draw a triangle of definite size. So too, the thinking mind, even if it does not think a magnitude, still places a quantitative body before its eyes, although it does not think it as such. If it is the nature of the quantitative in an indefinite sense with which the mind is concerned, then thought represents it under the form of a definite quantity, but thinks it merely as quantity. The reason why it is impossible to think anything apart from continuity (even things that are not subject to the laws of time cannot be thought without time) is a problem that belongs elsewhere. We must be conscious of magnitude and motion by the same faculty whereby we are conscious of time. An image is a product of sensation in general. Evidently, therefore, the cognition of these things is to be ascribed to the primary power of sense. Memory, even the memory of concepts, does not take place without an image. Consequently, memory concerns the faculty of thought accidentally, and the primary power of sense intrinsically. It is therefore possessed by other animals, and is not peculiar to man and creatures endowed with opinion and thought. If it were a property belonging to the conceptual powers, it would not be found in many animals outside of man, perhaps in none of the brutes, seeing that they do not, as a matter of fact, possess it, because they all lack the sense of time. For in an activity of memory, as we remarked before, there is always the additional consciousness that one has seen, or heard, or learned this in time past. Prior and later are properties of time. In reply to the question to what part of the soul memory is to be ascribed, it is plain that it belongs to the same part as imagination. The objects of memory, intrinsically, are the same as the objects of imagination. Accidentally, they are such objects as are impossible without imagination. The question might be asked, how in the world is it that, while a mental impression persists, although the thing itself is no longer at hand, one remembers what is not present? Evidently, we must regard this phenomenon, which through the mediation of sensation is produced in the soul, and in that part of the body which possesses sensation, whose persistence we call memory, as similar to a painting. For an active stimulus stamps on the soul a sort of imprint of the sensation, analogous to stamping with a seal ring. For this reason, too, persons who are deeply moved by passion or by the ardour of youth do not remember, just as if the effort and the seal were applied to running water. In other persons, because of their worn-out condition, like old buildings, or because of the hardness of their receptive principle, no impression is made. Consequently, the very young and the aged have poor memories, for the former are in a fluent condition owing to their growth, and the latter are unstable owing to their decay. Likewise, the excessively quick and the excessively slow seem to have poor memories. The former are too moist, and the latter too hard. Consequently, the image does not last in the souls of the former, and in the latter it does not fasten. If such is the truth regarding memory, the question arises whether one remembers the impression or the thing from which the impression was derived. For if it is this impression of ours which is the object of memory, then we do not remember what is absent. On the other hand, if it is the thing that we remember, how does it come that while we perceive this impression, we remember what we do not perceive, viz., the absent thing? And if memory is analogous to an imprint or picture within us, why should the perception of precisely this thing be the memory of something else, and not the memory of just this picture? For it is this impression which one contemplates and perceives in actual memory. In what sense, then, does one remember what is not present? It would then be possible to see and to hear what is not present. Or is there a sense in which this is possible and in which it actually occurs? For example, the animal in a picture is both animal and a copy, and both of these are one and the same thing. But the mode of existence in the two instances is different, and it is possible to regard this picture both in the sense of animal and in the sense of image, and so it is with the image within us. We must regard it both as something in itself and as the image of something else. Insofar as we regard it in its own nature, it is an idea, or a mental representation. Insofar as we regard it as belonging to something else, it is a copy or a memory. When, therefore, an actual stimulation of this image takes place, and when the soul perceives it in its own nature, it appears to come to expression as an idea or a phantasm. If, however, the soul regards it as belonging to something else, then, as in the case of a painting, the soul contemplates it as a copy, and as the picture of Coriscus, without having ever seen him. The points of view here, and in the case of our regarding a painted animal merely as an animal, are different. What arises in the soul in the latter case is purely a thought. In the former case, because the object is there regarded as an image, it appears as a memory. And, consequently, there are times when we do not know, regarding such physical processes due to earlier sensations, whether they are produced by sense experience, and we are in doubt whether they are a memory or not. At another time it happens, we think and recall that we have heard or known the thing in the past. This takes place when, after contemplating a thing in its own nature, one shifts one's position and regards it as the copy of another thing. The converse of this also happens, as is shown by the case of Antiphoron of Oreos, and other ecstatics, for they asserted that their phantasms were real, and that they remembered the things. This phenomenon occurs when one regards as a copy that which is not a copy. Exercise in repeatedly recalling a thing strengthens the memory. This, however, is nothing more nor less than the frequent contemplation of a thing as a copy, and not as an object in itself. The nature of memory and of its process has now been explained as the persistent possession of an image, in the sense of a copy of the thing to which the image refers, and it has been further explained to what faculty in us this belongs, viz., to the primary power of sensation, and to that organ whereby we perceive time. Chapter 2. The subject of recollection remains to be treated. First of all, we must take as presuppositions the truths which were established in the treatise on argumentation. Accordingly, recollection is neither the recovery nor acquirement of a memory. For when one learns or acquires an impression for the first time, one does not recover any memory, for none has preceded, nor does one acquire an initial memory. But when a persistent mental condition and impression is fixed in the soul, then we have memory. Consequently, memory is not produced simultaneously with the production of an impression. Further, in the indivisible complete moment, when the impression is first received, the impression and the knowledge are recorded in the affected subject, if one can call this mental condition and impression knowledge, and there is nothing to prevent our remembering, in the sense of accident, a certain thing which we know conceptually. But memory as such is not possible until after the lapse of time, for what we remember now we have previously known or experienced, but what we experience now is not in the present moment remembered. Further, it is evidently possible to have in memory what we do not now recollect, but what was once perceived or experienced. When one reacquires knowledge or sensation, or whatever the mental possession be to which we apply the term memory, it is then that one recollects one of the aforesaid mental possessions. The process of memory takes place, and memory ensues. Neither do the phenomena of recollection, if their occurrence is the repetition of a previous recollection, follow absolutely the same order, but sometimes they occur in one way, and sometimes in another. It is possible for the same individual to learn and discover the same thing twice. Recollection, then, must differ from learning and discovery, and there is need of greater initial latitude here than is the case with learning. Recollection is effected when one suggestion succeeds another in natural order. If the succession is a necessary one, it is plain that when the antecedent suggestion is given, it will excite the succeeding one. If, however, the succession is not a necessary one, but only customary, the recollection will be stirred generally. But it is a fact that some persons, by being impressed only once, are trained in a given way more than others after frequent impressions. And so there are some things which, after we have seen once, we remember better than others do who have seen them frequently. When, therefore, we recollect, we awaken certain antecedent processes, and continue this until we call up that particular experience, after which the desired one is wont to appear. That is the reason why we hunt through a series in thought, beginning with an object presently before us, or with something else, or with an object that is similar, or opposite, or contiguous. In this way, recollection is awakened. For mental movements in these instances are identical in some cases, in others simultaneous with the desired experience, and in other cases they involve a portion of it, so that there is a small remainder whose stimulation ensues. This, then, is the way in which people try to recollect, and without conscious effort they recollect in this way, when the desired experience is recalled as the sequence of another experience. For the most part, however, the desired experience is recalled only after several different suggestions, such as we have described, have preceded. One does not at all need to look at the remote and ask how we remember it, but at what lies near before us. For the same method applies to both cases, I mean the method of sequences, without any prior effort to find this sequence, and without recalling it. For mental movements follow one another, this one after that, by habituation. When a person wants to recall a thing, he will do the following. He will try to gain a starting point in the process, in sequence to which the desired experience was had. Consequently, recollections which are awakened from the starting point are most quickly and best effected. For just as things are mutually related in their order of succession, so also are the mental processes. And such things as have a fixed order are easily remembered, as, e.g., mathematical truths. Other things are remembered poorly and with difficulty. Recollection differs from relearning in this, that there can be, in the former case, a sort of self-movement back to that which follows upon the original experience. When this is not done, but the recollection is prompted by another person, then it is no longer memory. Oftentimes one is unable to recollect a thing, but after searching succeeds in finding it. This seeking and finding is what happens when one awakens a number of experiences, and continues to do so until one sets that particular experience in motion upon which the desired thing is attendant. Memory is the possession of an experience potentially revivable. This process is effected, as was said above, in such way that it comes from the person's own effort, and from the movements in his power. One must, however, have a starting point, and so persons appear sometimes to recall things from local suggestions. The reason is that one passes rapidly from one thing to another, e.g. from milk to the suggested idea of white, from white to air, from air to the moist, and from this one recalls the late autumn, which is the season one was trying to think of. In general, it is the middle two of the entire series that seems to be the starting point for memory. For when a person does not remember earlier, then he does so when he comes to the middle point, or when he does not remember here, then at no other point at all, as is the case, e.g., when one passes through the series A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. If one does not remember at H, one remembers when one plays. But from the same point of suggestion, one sometimes remembers and sometimes does not, the reason for which lies in the possibility of movement in more than one direction from the initial point, e.g., from E to F. We remember easily what we often ponder. For as one definite thing succeeds another in nature, so it is also in our activity. Frequent repetition produces nature. Since we find in the realm of nature occurrences that violate her laws and are due to chance, Much more do we find this in the realm of custom, to which the term nature cannot be applied in the same sense. The consequence is that a movement here sometimes takes place in one direction, and sometimes in another, especially when the mind is distracted from a particular point to something else. Therefore, when one has to remember a name, and remembers one like it, one commits a solecism in regard to it. This, then, is the way in which recollection takes place. The most important thing here is the necessity of appreciating time, whether in a determinate or an indeterminate form. There must be some power whereby we distinguish a longer from a shorter interval. It is natural that the same conditions which apply to magnitudes apply here also. For we think what is large and what is remote in space, not because thought extends to the given point, as some say in their explanation of vision, for we can think the non-existent as well as the existent, but because of an analogous process in the mind. For the figures and processes that correspond to things are in the mind itself. What difference will it make, then, whether one thinks what is larger, or the other class of things that are smaller? For all the internal elements are smaller, and the external have, as it were, a proportional magnitude to them. It is perhaps in the case of distances in space, just as it is with figures, one has to assume the possession of another analogous figure in the mind itself. So, e.g., if one draws the lines EB and BE, one produces CD. For AC and CD are proportional. Why does this produce the line CD rather than FG? Or is this due to the fact that as AF is to AB, so H is to M? For these lines are drawn at the same time. And if one wants to think the line FG, one thinks similarly the line BE, and instead of HI, one thinks KL, for these are related to each other as FA to BA. When the suggestion of the thing and the suggestion of time coincide, we have actual memory. When, however, one believes one does this without really doing it, one only believes that one remembers. For there is nothing to prevent one's being deceived and fancying that one remembers without this being actually the case. In actually remembering, it is impossible that one should not believe one is remembering, but should be unconscious of it. For this is just what constitutes memory. If, however, the suggestion of the thing and the suggestion of time are separated from each other, then no memory is awakened. The suggestion of time has a twofold meaning. Sometimes a thing is not remembered in determinate time, e.g., that day before yesterday one did something or other. In other instances, one remembers in terms of time measure. Memory, however, takes place even if one does not remember in the latter way. People are wont to say that they remember, although they do not know just when a thing happened, in cases where they are ignorant of the determinate measure of the when. We have already said that the same individuals are not endowed with good memory and good recollection. Recollection differs from memory not merely in the time element, but also because many animals share the endowment of memory, while none of the known animals, one may say, excepting man, is endowed with recollection. The reason for this is that recollection is a sort of syllogistic process. In recollection, one reasons that one has known, or heard, or had some such experience of the thing in question, and the process is a sort of inquiry. And this is naturally found only in those creatures which have the power of deliberation, and deliberation is a kind of syllogistic procedure. That this condition affects the body, and that recollection is the search for an image in a corporeal organ, is proved by the fact that many persons are made very restless when they cannot recall a thing, and when quite inhibiting their thought, and no longer trying to remember, they do recollect, nevertheless, as is especially true of the melancholic. For such persons are most moved by images. The reason why recollection does not lie within our power is this. Just as a person who has thrown an object can no longer bring it to rest, so too one who recollects and goes in search of a thing sets a corporeal something in motion in which the desired experience resides. Especially disturbed are such persons as have moisture about the region of sensation, for they do not easily come to rest after being stirred into motion until they attain the thing sought for, or the movement has taken its proper course. Consequently, the feelings of anger and fear, when they once set up a movement, do not cease, although opposing movements are started against them, but, on the contrary, persist towards their own aim. This affection resembles names, melodies, and words, when these are given violent utterance. For, after one has ceased, the singing or speaking recurs involuntarily. Further, those whose upper body is too large, and also dwarfish persons, have less power of recollection than those of the opposite physical structure, because the former are too heavy about the organs of sensation, and because the initial movements cannot persist, but are destroyed, and direct movement in the process of recollection cannot readily take place. Also, the exceedingly young and the very old do not recollect well on account of their movement, for the latter are in decline, and the former in rapid growth. Furthermore, children are like dwarfs until they advance in age. We have now treated the subject of memory and its process, its nature and the physical organ whereby animals remember. Also, the subject of recollection in its nature, its forms, and its causes. End of chapter 2, and end of On Memory and Recollection. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards.